The field of regenerative medicine focuses on producing artificial substitutes that could restore or replace damaged tissues or organs. It's also referred to as tissue engineering. We've known how to transplant organs for decades, but transplants are extremely difficult and a limited supply prevents some who need new organs from receiving them. Demand for organ transplants can exceed the supply from donors by over 300%. And in many cases, transplants are the only treatment available that will save a patient's life. Now, what if we were not reliant on the supply of donated organs coming from humans, but could instead generate them artificially? That might sound even more difficult. If transplanting an existing organ is hard, wouldn't transplanting an artificial organ be even more difficult? Well, what we'll talk about today is how nanoscience is being used to advance this field. And we'll walk through a collection of very promising discoveries that demonstrate that the future of medicine for damaged tissue and organs should be very different from the present. Let's start with artificial tissues and work our way up to artificial organs. We've talked about study after study during our lectures where cells cultured in the lab are used to study all kinds of things. And labs are really quite good by now at growing almost any kind of cell you can think of in a petri dish. And simple kinds of materials like skin and cartilage can be made using analogous methods to the ones that we use just to culture cells in the lab for research. There are actually already forms of these tissues on the market, and they are used to treat burn victims. So while we can grow cells and layers of cells, what we're still not good at is putting cells together into more complicated structures. You can think of tissues and organs kind of like buildings. In order to build something functional, the building blocks or bricks need to be organized. Same goes for the tissues of human organs. The cells have to be oriented in specific directions, and certain types of cells need to be interfaced in a particular way. Just like buildings need plumbing and electricity running throughout in very specific locations, tissues and organs need blood vessels and they need nerves. So it's difficult, but not impossible, to build up a structure made of one kind of a cell, but it's really difficult to build up structures where components need to come together that are made of many different kinds of cells. Now, this is where nanotechnology can make a difference. One of the reasons that organs and tissues know how to self-organize in the body is that they're able to take advantage of cues provided by their environment to know which direction to spread out in. You now appreciate that nanotechnology's main aim is to manipulate matter at the nanoscale. And it turns out that this is exactly what needs to be done in order to provide scaffolds that will bring cells together and allow them to interact in such a way that functional tissue will grow. Before we turn to artificial scaffolds made with nanotechnology, let's first look at the actual scaffolds used by nature. In human beings, the scaffold is a very complex network of proteins that come together and provide an environment that cells really like to grow in. This scaffold is called the extracellular matrix. And the image that you're looking at shows how all the strands of proteins come together to make this matrix. It takes billions of protein molecules to come together and form the fibers that then interconnect to form this structure. One of the proteins that's involved here, collagen, may be familiar to you. We touched on the function of collagen a few lectures ago and talked about the fact that it's good at giving tissue structure. And it turns out that collagen is a major component of the extracellular matrix, and its fibrous structure is a key structural feature. Now, this extracellular matrix may look somewhat disorganized, but it's actually really a complex structure with a high level of organization. Each protein is in a precise location so that it can guide a cell to grow in a certain direction. This matrix also binds factors that may stimulate directional growth and tell a cell what direction to head in. And it's now known that this extracellular matrix gives an organ its overall structure, and it's a very robust entity. Just in the last few years, scientists have learned that they can take an organ and they can gently separate all of the cells from the extracellular matrix by soaking the organ in a bit of detergent. Once they do this, they have an organ that is primarily the extracellular matrix. And this has been done with livers, with lungs, with arteries, and other types of organs. Now, in this state, these organs are not functional because they don't have the cells there, and so that takes away the functionality of the organ. But incredibly enough, they can then regrow cells using the extracellular matrix as a scaffold, and the functionality of the organ returns. This is really incredible. I mentioned that this has been done with a variety of organ types. And in a recent study reported in the journal Science in 2010, a landmark study was reported showing that a regenerated lung could be transplanted into a rat. You are looking at images of a rat lung before it's treated to remove the cells, and then after the cells have been dissolved. It's white because the only thing left behind was the extracellular matrix. You can see that the color comes back once the cells are regrown. If we zoom in using electron microscopy, you can actually see the cells on the matrix that then disappear after the lung has been removed. So this procedure is really good at just removing the cells and leaving everything else intact. You can see that the extracellular matrix basically stays unperturbed. And even more amazingly, the lung not only had newly grown cells, this lung was actually functional. It was a little bit leaky, and there were a few blood cells in places that they were not supposed to be, but the rats that received the transplants could do everything that rats with 2 normal lungs could do. So this work demonstrates how robust the extracellular matrix really is. It's strong, and that allows us to reuse organs by growing new cells using the matrix as a scaffold. But this doesn't really help us with the organ transplant problem. It may increase the number of usable organs that could be regenerated, but it doesn't help us make new ones from scratch. Now, what if we could recreate the extracellular matrix from synthetic components? That would solve the problem. And given that the matrix is just a collection of proteins, and we know how to synthesize proteins in large quantities in the lab, this should be doable, right? Well, it turns out that it's not that simple. The formation of the extracellular matrix is a very precise, programmed process that biology knows how to organize, but unfortunately, we don't know yet how to recreate it. So we need to find solutions that will allow us to recreate the features of the matrix in a form that we can work with to grow new organs. This is where nanotechnology can play a role. We've seen a variety of nanomaterials that might be able to provide the right type of scaffold. And so the rationale here is that engineering the right material might be a way to recreate the extracellular matrix. One approach to this is to use different nanopatterns on surfaces to grow cells oriented in specific ways. Just a few years ago, a team led by Dr. Bob Langer at MIT showed that nanopatterning a hard surface could have a dramatic effect on cell orientation. Langer is really a pioneer in this field, and he's an amazing scientist. He has a research group of about 100 people. He's obtained over 200 patents and has started 25 different biotech companies. He's a chemical engineer who has learned to use nanotechnology to solve a number of important problems, including some very pertinent to today's topic of tissue engineering. So here you're looking at a comparison of cell growth happening on a nanograding made by Langer's group that has a spacing of just a few hundred nanometers versus a flat substrate. It's made using a technique called replica molding that involves making a master mold, and for this you use a hard material like silicon that has the features that are desired in the final product. Then a type of polymer can be poured into the master, and then it's cured. And this process allows lots of substrates to be produced from one master. Now, as you can see from these images, on the non-nanostructured substrate, the cell doesn't really know what direction to go, and it just balls up. With the nanograding, it seems to know that it should stretch in the same direction as the nanoscale pattern. This is really incredible. Now, why does this happen? Well, it's related to what happens in nature. In the extracellular matrix, there are fibers of materials like collagen that form oriented fibers. In this image of collagen, you can see that in the yellow portion of the image, there are fibers lined up in a pattern that look very much like the nanograding. The spacing is even the same. So then what has been created using nanotechnology is a material that's a pretty good mimic of oriented collagen. So that's a start. Okay, so now we've looked at a single cell, and it's clear that nanostructuring influences directionality of cell growth. But can we engineer something more complex, not involving just a single cell, but a collection of cells that could eventually be used in the body? Well, the same group looked at a type of cell called endothelial progenitor cells. We'll call these EPCs for short. And they looked at how their growth was affected by the presence of a nanopattern. EPCs are the precursor cells that form the inside of a blood vessel. So this is a great system to look at to evaluate whether artificial blood vessels could be grown. The difference in how these cells grew on flat surfaces versus a nanograding is really amazing. On the flat surface, the cells grow well, and you can see them trying to organize into vessels. But they are not organized enough, and all of the interconnectedness of the short vessels that are formed makes them useless. But now on the nanograding, you can see that nice long vessels are instead formed. It's clear that here too, the cells are really taking a cue from the grading, and they're heading in a certain direction in response. Now, gratings are not the only nanomaterials that can be used for this type of application. Nanoposts work really well here too. A group working at the School of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering at the Seoul National University in Korea was able to show that they could get cells called fibroblasts to thread themselves through a nanograting if the posts had the right spacing. Now, fibroblasts are cells in the body that produce lots of collagen, a material important to the extracellular matrix. So they're working with an interesting cell type that's very relevant for regenerative medicine. We could imagine that if we could generate the right starting scaffold with nanotechnology and then coerce fibroblasts to grow in the right directions, perhaps we could then get an extracellular matrix to grow on a substrate as the starting place for an artificial organ. Okay, so now we've looked at how cells can be grown on different types of nanopatterned surfaces. These types of nanostructures are made with what we refer to as top-down fabrication. That means that you come in from the top with some way to create the nanopattern yourself. But that's not the only way to do this. Let's look at a group of nanostructures very relevant to regenerative medicine that are made using what we call bottom-up methods. This means that the materials basically self-assemble to perform a desired role, and they don't require any kind of top-down processing. One example of this is a peptide nanofiber that self-assembles into a very powerful type of material. This peptide has a hydrophobic region that when it gets put in water, it wants to huddle together with other peptides so that it doesn't come into contact with the water, just like grease in water would act. So this peptide then ends up forming long fibers that then self-assemble into a gel. Now, if we zoom in and look at the nanoscopic structure of this gel, we can see that, wow, it looks an awful lot like the extracellular matrix. The scientists who invented this material recognized right away that they had something really special in hand when they first saw this structure. And we actually already touched on another application of this peptide gel in the last lecture when we discussed a gel that could stop bleeding during surgery. When this peptide was sprayed on a wound, it acted like a hemostat and it quickly stopped bleeding. It's probably the case that the matrix formed stopped blood cells from leaving the vessel. Now here, we're talking about this peptide nanofiber because the idea is that this artificial matrix made of peptide nanofiber could act as a mimic of the extracellular matrix. Let's see what it's able to do when it comes to growing cells. One of the first cell types that was tested with this material was neural progenitor cells, or NPCs. Like the epithelial progenitor cells we talked about before, these neural progenitors are precursor cells. The NPCs in this case will mature into neural cells. Now, a neural progenitor cell is precisely the type of cell that, if we could get it to grow into a precise structure and could control that process, we could use these to repair central nervous system damage. Neural damage, as I'm sure you know, can be devastating. We're all familiar with how falls and accidents can cause spinal cord injury, like the incident in which Christopher Reeve was thrown from a horse and left quadriplegic. And unfortunately, this type of injury is almost impossible to recover from because the damage can't be reversed. Nerve cells are just not good at regrowing, and so the gaps that are formed, for example, in the spinal cord, during injury persist, and they basically cause gaps in the communication that is essential for the function of the nervous system. So the development of methods that would allow us to regenerate nervous system tissue would have a tremendous impact. Now, why is neural damage so difficult to repair? Well, the nervous system contains a complicated type of tissue. It's a network of fibers and neurons that send electrochemical signals over long distances. Neurons, or nerve cells, have a much more complicated structure than most other cell types because of the electrical communication that they participate in. These structures that you see protruding from this nerve cell are called dendrites, and they help to extend the reach of the cell's communication range. These cells are actually pretty difficult to grow in the lab, and it's even more difficult to get them to grow into the fibers that are found in the human body. So, can a peptide nanofiber assist with the generation of artificial nerves? To test this, the group at Northwestern University who originally developed the material mixed the peptide with a solution of NPCs, and they allowed the peptide nanofibers to self-assemble around the neural cells. That's what makes the generation of this material bottom-up rather than top-down. The nanomaterial makes its structure spontaneously, and it knows just how to self-assemble around the progenitor cells. And then, these encapsulated progenitor cells can get cues from the newly formed nanomaterial. And so what the researchers then observed is that growing the NPCs in this environment allowed them to grow much more efficiently. You can see in this image that there are dendrites coming off of a cell, and this is somewhat unusual to see in a cultured neural cell. And so with this promising result in hand, this group then went on to test whether this material could repair spinal cord injury in mice. And mice who received a treatment of peptide nanofiber after spinal cord injury recovered about 90% of their normal functions, and they fared much better than a control group. And interestingly, the researchers who did the study found not only that neural regrowth improved significantly, but also that scarring, which causes big problems in the event of spinal cord injury, was minimized. And this is really a complicating effect in spinal cord injury. So you have the actual injury, you have the cells that get damaged and that gap that happens. And then at the junctions where the injury occurs, you can have scarring that prevents any further growth. So this was a really exciting result to see. And at the time, they didn't really understand the origin of this effect, and we still don't understand exactly why the nanofiber is able to limit scarring, but it's a really encouraging type of behavior to see out of this compound. Another study that was done as a collaboration between a group at MIT and a group in Hong Kong used an analogous peptide-based material. And they looked at a similar phenomenon, but they used a slightly different readout. Here they're going to be looking specifically at vision and the restoration of vision. And so what they did is they used a mouse model, and then they cut a specific nerve axon that's essential for vision. And then they looked at these mice, again, a control group with no treatment and a group that had the peptide as a treatment, and then watched how their sight could come back. And this is something that you can do very quantitatively with mice. What you do is you give them a visual stimulus and you watch to see whether they respond. And so you can tabulate the statistics around how many times they respond to the stimulus and get good specific quantitation on how much of their vision has come back. And so this is a really great way to determine whether a peptide nanofiber can promote nerve growth. In a control group that didn't get any treatment, the mice only got back about 10% of their vision. So this is basically just the natural levels of neural regrowth. But the group that was treated with the nanofiber got back 80%. That is really incredible. And it's somewhat comparable to what was seen in the last study, but that was much more qualitative, whereas this is a quantitative measure of vision. And so it indicates that this type of approach could bring back high levels of other functions, like speech and motor skills and all of the things that we want to bring back to people that have had spinal cord damage. So far, we've looked at some very promising examples of nanomaterials that can support cell growth that have very exciting potential for regenerative medicine. But we still haven't seen an actual example of an artificial organ. So let's take a look at an example of a tissue engineering project more advanced than what I've just shown you, an astonishing first step towards an artificial liver. The liver is an essential organ that detoxifies our blood. It produces proteins and hormones and provides molecules that we need for digestion. About 80% of the cells in the liver are what we call hepatocytes. They're really good at synthesizing essential proteins and hormones, and they're really good at breaking down chemicals like drugs. In order for hepatocytes to do their work on all of the blood in our bodies, the cells need to be in close contact with the blood running through the circulatory system. And so the liver has a very intricate system of vessels running through it. It's like a building with lots of plumbing in every room. The vessels are organized into repeating hexagonal columns that have a central vein running through the center of each column. And then the arteries are located at the junctions between the columns. There are also ducts that run through the liver that transport bile, one of the most important molecules that the liver makes, and these ducts take it out of the liver. So you can see that this is a very complicated set of structures to think about reproducing in an artificial organ. One of the first attempts to make an artificial liver involved the fabrication of a device that had a collection of tiny channels that could pump blood. The channels were made of a porous material, and then liver cells were grown on top of the channels. The group that made this device showed that the liver cells were really happy and healthy. And they weren't being given any external sources of food, so they were clearly able to extract nutrients from the blood that was flowing by. The levels of a particular protein that the liver produces were also measured, and it was clear that the hepatocytes were doing their thing and they were excreting proteins into the blood. So the basic level of functionality was there. What they did next was to increase the throughput of the device so that it could be used as a substitute for a human liver. They increased the throughput by creating a stacked device that brought together many of these blood vessel chips with layers of hepatocytes. This device could basically handle the amount of blood that needs to be processed by a human in a single day. But with that said, we're probably not going to see these types of devices being implanted into patients really soon. So far, these devices have been designed to function more like dialysis instruments rather than organ replacements. In order for an organ to be successfully implanted, its surface needs to be covered in cells that the transplant recipient's immune system will recognize. Otherwise, the body will try to reject the organ and serious inflammation will result. So this is a different type of problem, kind of a second-generation problem that needs to be solved, but it's one that's actually already been sorted out for devices that are used already, like artificial joints and corneas and the other types of tissues that we've learned to implant. So there's definitely a good chance that we will eventually be able to engineer some kind of coating for this device so that it can be used in vivo. Now, one way, a separate approach, and this gets around the compatibility problem, is to use a portion of a recipient's damaged organ to begin building or growing a new organ. This has been done for some simpler organs, like the bladder, and the transplants of these semi-synthetic organs have been successful. And this type of approach could be effective for organs that really only have partial damage, and it likely won't be feasible for organs that have a complex blood supply. So there clearly is still a need for the de novo organ fabrication that nano-regenerative medicine researchers are working towards. So we'll have to stay tuned to see where this field is headed. It's clear that the potential for impact is huge, given that the problems being solved are really intractable by any other means. The fields of biology and medicine are really being transformed by increases in our ability to understand biology and intervene at the nanoscale level. As you've just seen, cells, which are a little too large to be considered nanoscale, can still be manipulated using the cues that nanomaterials can give them. The fact that biology operates at the nanoscale with tiny messenger molecules carrying out all of the work that cells do and giving cells clues about how to grow means that working at the nanoscale is quite important. With the advances that I've described to you today, we now have materials that allow cells to grow with defined orientations and allow them to assemble into the kinds of complex structures that are found in humans. You now know that there are nanomaterials that are really good at helping cells regrow after an injury. This adds to the other advances we've looked at in nanomedicine, like improved drug delivery, earlier disease diagnosis, and better tools for surgery. And these are all materials that simply did not exist before nanotechnology enabled us to manipulate matter at such a fine length scale. The many examples of nanotechnology in medicine that we've looked at really illustrate why nanoscale precision is so important for applications in medicine. Without it, we just can't recreate the same types of materials and structures that nature uses to build our tissues and organs. And we can't get the precision needed for effective drug delivery or surgery. In the first half of the next lecture, I'll conclude our discussion of nanomedicine by talking about how nanotechnology research actually gets done. Ted Sargent will be taking the second half of this lecture, and together we'll take a dive into what it takes to build a successful team of nanotechnology researchers and how they pull together to make the kinds of exciting discoveries that we've covered so far. See you next time.
We've spoken about some of the fascinating ways in which nanotechnology can be used to try to make solar cells that are more efficient, more cost-effective, ideally both. We touched on one concept, the photon trapping concept, in which it's possible to capture light inside a solar cell, give it multiple opportunities for absorption. It turns out that there's another way in which we can use nanoparticles for a similar purpose, and it's a very convenient one from the point of view of fabrication. Let's think back to when we talked about plasmons or plasmonics. At the time we were talking about ways of communicating information across a chip using light, and plasmonics provided a particularly convenient means of conveying information, optical information, and confining light to very small regions. The basis for this was particles of metal that are very small, 10 to 100 nanometers, and we talked about how it was a bit like stepping on stones across a pond or across a river. Well, now think of being perpendicular to those stones and think of being the river. Those stones now look like scattering centers if you're the river. Well, in photovoltaics, there's an emerging effort where people are trying to use metal nanoparticles, these plasmonic particles, in order to scatter light in various directions. So this is analogous in its function to what we do with light trapping. Now, instead of using the spiky silicon interface in order to give light multiple chances to bounce around inside our device, instead, we send light in from the sun, and it scatters off in multiple directions off of these scattering points that are the metal nanoparticles. What's so convenient is that nanotechnologists know very well now how to synthesize metal nanoparticles, colloidal particles, dispersed in a solution in a solvent, paintable materials, and simply coat them onto things. And so it provides a very ready means of making devices that have a greater capacity to enhance the absorption of light using nanoscale interactions between light and, in this case, metals. We spoke quite a bit about the limitations of making a solar cell having a single junction, having one semiconductor type. And so the obvious solution there is to make a semiconductor device that has many different band gaps. And in fact, before the advent of the latest solution-processed nanotechnology-based approaches, there had been much work on what are called tandem and triple junction solar cells, and they were very effective in making very efficient devices. The concept looked like this. Semiconductors of different types having different band gaps were grown on top of each other. So, for example, we were able to use compound semiconductors like the gallium arsenide that we heard about in our lecture on optical communications, and grow semiconductors with different compositions. One layer could be made with gallium arsenide, another with indium arsenide. And these different compositions led to different band gaps. Now, these cells offered a real advantage in terms of the efficiency of the device because they allowed us to make a first cell, the one closest to the light, that produced the absorption of visible light primarily. The visible light, as we discussed, had very energetic photons in it, and we used a large band gap in this material. We were able to harvest this portion of the sun's spectrum in a way that gave us a lot of voltage corresponding to the abundant energy in those photons. And only then did we step down to an intermediate band gap layer and then to a small band gap layer. These produced lower voltages, but they mopped up the photons that made it through the visible band gap cell. Now, the design of these tandem and triple junction solar cells is not trivial at all. They're passing a single current throughout this entire structure, but their voltages are adding up. And so they need to be designed in such a way that the current generated within each layer is the same. This challenge is known as current matching. It's a well-known art, but it complicates the design of the devices. But in the traditional triple junction devices, there's an added complication. It's the following. We're trying to grow a perfect crystal, having a single lattice with a defined spacing amongst the atoms. But we're doing it with different materials. And every different material has its own lattice constant. It has its own characteristic spacing amongst the atoms. If each one of these will be a perfect crystal, then how can they be integrated with one another without having slips, without, say, the gallium arsenide having a slip in its lattice periodicity relative to the differently periodic indium arsenide material? Well, the answer is that actually we can't, and that these slips are a problem. They create interfaces, dangling bonds, unpassivated states. They're places where we can lose efficiency or lose reliability in our solar cell. As a result, in making these stacked solar cells, researchers were forced to come up with even more complex materials combinations using 3 or 4 constituent atoms in very specific ratios such that the atoms got spaced out and could be matched. This is referred to as lattice matching. It's effective, but you can imagine that the approach leads to costly solar cells. It turns out there is a venue in which these multi-junction solar cells, even the very costly ones, can be used very effectively. The reason cost ends up being a problem, of course, in solar cells is if we need to have a very large area solar cell, which is normally how we do things. If we cover an entire roof or a building with these kinds of materials, we'll be very sensitive to very large, high costs per surface area. However, there's a field within solar photovoltaics known as concentrating photovoltaics, in which we use optical methods in order to focus light down from the sun onto a very small solar cell. In fact, we're able to achieve very high concentrations in this manner. So instead of operating at 1 sun, we can operate at 100 or 400 or 500 suns. And now, because we focus the light down onto an individual solar cell that's much, much smaller than the area from which we're catching our photons, we can get away with making a solar cell that has higher cost. So these very efficient, very good in their spectral utilization solar cells do have a place, and it's in concentrated photovoltaics. Here, though, the challenge now on the cost front becomes twofold. The first is that these concentrated photovoltaics have these optical systems that need to focus all the light down onto these solar cells. So there's an additional element. Now we're starting to use some optics and lenses for focusing inside these devices. And that adds some cost. The other component is that now we're looking up at the sun and we're focusing it down to a spot where if we were to tilt our solar cell a bit relative to the sun, or more likely if the sun is passing overhead as a function of time of day, and therefore it's a different angle relative to our device, unless we orient our concentrating optical solar cell just right relative to the sun's rays, we won't end up focusing onto our solar cell. We'll be off focus. And as a result, these concentrated solar cells also require tracking. So they end up having to follow the sun over the course of the day and follow its angle. This can be done. It also creates additional complications in terms of cost and reliability and maintenance of these installations. And so what we would love to do is to be able to achieve these triple junction solar cell efficiencies, these very, very high performance devices, but in a manner that doesn't require the cost and the complexity associated with growing compound semiconductors on top of each other in this lattice matched fashion. And it is this area where we seek high spectral utilization efficiency, full addressing of the sun's broad spectrum, but we combine it with low cost, that some of the most exciting work in nanotechnology-based solar cells is ongoing today. And I'll now talk about 3 examples of broad areas in which people are really pushing the boundaries on using the sun's broad spectrum better through the use of nanotechnology. The first of these is called organic or polymer solar cells. And in my lectures throughout this course, you've heard a lot more about what we call inorganic materials. You've heard about semiconductors like silicon and gallium arsenide, the bases for electronics and for optoelectronics and optical communications, glass as well. And it's more from Shana in her discussions of biology, biomaterials, and biomolecules that you've heard about carbon-containing organic molecules. Well, this field of organic photovoltaics seeks to marry some of the very desirable properties of the organic materials with the urgent need to make solar cells that are much more cost effective. You can immediately think of one of the obvious advantages of moving to an organic approach to making solar cells, which is that they're more compatible with physical flexibility. This is also the way we think about the biological world, that it's bendier than some of these rigid silicon-based solar cells. And that's absolutely correct. And so the early work on making physically flexible solar cells with their attractive properties in terms of low cost of manufacture, convenient deployment, has come from this field of organic polymer solar cells. The organic molecules themselves, this field of synthesis of organic molecules is incredibly well developed. It's the same field that has given us the capacity to synthesize all sorts of new drugs in biomedical applications. It's the same field that has allowed us to generate polymers that we use throughout our life that are integrated into fabrics and that are used to create synthetic rubber. So this field of organic synthesis is incredibly well developed. People who do synthetic organic chemistry know how to make a really broad swath of molecules designed to achieve the precise functions that we desire. Now, in organic photovoltaics, the name of the game, of course, is strong absorption, but also conduction of energy, conduction of electrons along the chains. And here researchers discovered a number of decades ago means of making these organic molecules, which traditionally we thought of as insulators. We hadn't thought of them as electronic materials capable of conduction. They found ways of using the bonds that they could engineer along these chains of polymers and of achieving the delocalization of electrons, where electrons could be everywhere along these chains. Essentially, they found ways to replicate the good qualities of semiconductors and replicate them within this organic system. What they had done is figured out a way to make a molecule that could be scaled up, synthesized in a beaker, cast onto a solid substrate, printed on with an inkjet printer, but where the molecule could function as a semiconductor. This obviously is a powerful platform for thinking about how to make low-cost solar cells. Now, the other component, of course, of making a good solar cell is to think about the way it utilizes the sun's spectrum. And there's some advantages to the organics on this front as well. In particular, researchers are able to design and define the function, the optical resonances of these materials to lie somewhere in between the properties of individual atoms and the properties of semiconductors. Recall that in the case of individual atoms, we have these very discrete levels. In the case of semiconductors, we spread those levels out into bands. Well, the organic molecules are kind of in between those two length scales spatially. They're typically a few nanometers in size. And these very, very well-defined, tight, discrete energy levels, characteristic of the atoms, researchers are able to translate those over to the molecular scale and to keep more of the remnants of these discrete levels. As a consequence, there's an incredible strength associated with the optical transitions that occur within these organic molecules. There is an extremely strong absorption of light in these designer molecules. And as a result, one can put down an incredibly thin amount of these materials and still achieve very complete absorption of light. So, for example, if for silicon to achieve complete absorption across the sun's full spectrum can require 100 micrometers of material, a large thickness of semiconductor, some of these organic molecules can achieve within their bandwidth of absorption, can achieve substantially complete absorption within a few dozen nanometers. So they're incredibly strong absorbers. They're incredibly black. Now, the fact that we've concentrated this absorption into this rather narrow band, of course, implies that we're not necessarily addressing the sun's full spectrum. And so we need a strategy in organic photovoltaics to address the sun's full spectrum properly. And here, it's through the mixing of semiconductors having different properties, or it's through the realization of tandem and triple junction solar cells, where each one of these layers consists of a different organic molecule, each tailored to managing a particular portion of the sun's spectrum, that we're able to leverage the very strong absorption of these materials and overcome this limitation of a somewhat more narrowband behavior. Now, there's some very beautiful physics that people working on organic solar cells have also been able to engineer. Really, their solar cells operate on a somewhat different physical principle from the classical junction device, the diode, that's the basis for all electronics, and that's been translated into the photodiode for light sensing and the photovoltaic device for traditional inorganic semiconductor-based photovoltaics. The concept at work in organic photovoltaics that was quite distinctive when it was introduced a little while ago in the 1990s is what's called a donor-acceptor junction. And here, rather than making the semiconductor device out of a single type of semiconductor having two different types of impurities, an electron richness and an electron impoverished quality, instead, these organic molecules tend not to be rich in free electrons, but they tend to be very engineerable, such that the energy levels in two different molecules can be matched up such that there is an asymmetry. We talked about the need for an asymmetry to make a good solar cell. They can be matched up such that electrons generated in a first class of molecules, known as the donor, are very efficiently donated to an adjacent molecule that functions as the acceptor. Essentially, when light comes in inside these solar cells, it generates what's known as an exciton, so an excited particle, and that particle ends up being split apart and pulled into the acceptor molecules and therefore given a much longer lifetime for its extraction of these solar cells. The reason it's so important to extract these energetic charge carriers efficiently in organic solar cells is that the transport properties, the mobilities of electrons inside these materials is much lower than it is in these perfectly regular semiconductors such as silicon or gallium arsenide. And so it's important to find a way station for these excited charge carriers. Rather than have their energy disappear on us before the charges can be extracted, it's important to give ourselves a little bit more time to get the energy out of these devices. And the donor-acceptor junction gives us that. There's also some beautiful engineering that's been done with those donor-acceptor junctions, now not so much in the energetic domain as I was just describing, but in the spatial domain. Researchers figured out how to ensure that the donor and the acceptor could interpenetrate. The problem, if they just made a planar interface between the donor and the acceptor, was that they weren't able to make that device thick enough such that it absorbed all the light and yet also led to the efficient extraction of the energetic electrons. But when they made interpenetrating fingers of donor and acceptor material, they were able to increase the amount of each material that was included, which was very useful in enhancing the absorption of light, but at the same time ensure that wherever an excited electron was generated within the donor, the electrons were very close to an escape hatch. They were very close to one of these energetically favorable interfaces that led to the safe extraction of the charge carrier. And what's so beautiful about these bulk heterojunctions is that to create these nanostructured materials, nanostructured on the scale of 10s, 20s, 30s of nanometers, it wasn't necessary to consciously go in and manipulate matter, define formal fingers using some kind of template or an etching process, but instead the chemists designed these materials such that they liked to segregate. So such that when they just mixed them together and coated them down, that material A was inclined to form a phase of its own, and material B formed an interpenetrating phase, so that they naturally segregated into these kinds of fingers. Now, there's much work that's been done to get these fingers to have these defined properties that are so desired. Clearly, fingers are good, but islands are bad. If we have isolated regions of these organic materials, we're not going to be able to extract the electrons out of them. So much beautiful work has gone into both building these materials such that the phase segregation occurs on the right length scale and leads to a continuous junction where we're able to continually extract the electrons into our acceptor, while at the same time not producing undesired islanding. Solar cells have been made using these organics that stack multiple junctions on top of each other. In fact, there's been some very nice work in recent years in which every single layer, from the electrodes, the conductors, through to the semiconductors, through to the junction that brings together the 2 or eventually it will be 3 and more junctions inside one of these solar cells are all made by spin coating, by solution processing. And so this is now compatible with the realization of organic solar cells that are very low in cost, and yet through the tandem concept, through the better spectral harvesting, compatible also with higher efficiencies. Another way that nano enters into the organic solar cell is through the constituent materials. In those donor-acceptor junctions, one of the stars of the show is the buckyball. This molecule, which looks just like a soccer ball, is nanometers in size, is responsible for participating in the light absorption and extraction process within these organic solar cells. The buckyballs have a very tunable electronic band structure, and researchers figured out how to make them soluble. In their native state, the buckyballs are not actually soluble in convenient solvents. But researchers were able to attach molecules to the surface of these buckyballs to make them soluble in convenient solvents in order to render them compatible with the attractive features of making an organic solar cell this way. Let's move on to another area that gets back more to the inorganic, to these traditional crystalline semiconductors, and that happens to be the area in which I also work. I work in the field of colloidal quantum dot solar cells. That's what my research group at the university focuses on. We've seen these quantum dots before in some different contexts throughout the course. As a refresher, they're semiconductor particles. They're a few nanometers in size, and they are inorganic crystals. So they're semiconductor particles that have this band structure that we get to tune or define through the quantum size effect, through the size of the particles. And that spectral tunability is one of the features that we've used in various applications throughout. For example, in our discussions of sensing the world through imaging, we've talked about how we're able to tune which colors of light these semiconductor particles absorb in order to see within spectral regimes that are previously unavailable to us using traditional semiconductor approaches. Well, in the context of solar cells, this tunability is also extremely attractive and important. By tuning the size of these particles, by changing their band gap, we change whether they absorb visible or infrared or longer wavelengths of infrared light. And so one of the things that's so appealing in working with these quantum dots as our particle is that if you think back to the tandem solar cell that we were talking about earlier in today's lecture, there we had to find different materials of different compositions to stack on top of each other, and we had to find some kind of way to match their lattices, match the spacing of their atoms. Well, that was what led to cost and to our discussion of concentrated photovoltaics, which is essentially trying to overcome the challenges in the cost of those devices. But when we work with quantum size effect tunability, we can take a single semiconductor technology based on a single composition of semiconductor. We can master the synthesis and then the processing of devices based on this single semiconductor having a single composition. And then through the quantum size effect alone, through how we change the recipe at the time of the synthesis of these particles, through that method alone, we were able to choose the band gaps. And so with these semiconductor nanoparticles, we have an avenue towards making tandem and triple junction solar cells based on colloidal quantum dots. And just recently, we reported the ability to make a solar cell where the band gaps of the constituent junctions were chosen purely through the quantum size effect to be optimal for the 2 junctions of a tandem cell. And so this proved the concept that we can really, working with a single material, we can utilize quantum effects to gain dexterity in our control over the band gap without actually having to change the material itself, just with a little tweak to our recipe. One of the beautiful things about these semiconductor nanoparticles is we don't have to limit ourselves to a single shape. We don't have to confine ourselves just to these quantum dots, these semiconductor nanoparticles. But we're also able to make elongated structures, which we refer to as rods. And in these rods, there's clearly a preference for flow along one axis, the long axis. Here we just have a perfect semiconductor crystal that's very compatible with the delocalization of electrons along its length. So these materials have attracted great interest because of their enhanced electronic transport properties. Of course, when you think about what will happen when you take some of these rods out of solution and you coat them onto a substrate, well, the most likely thing is the rods will lie down in the substrate, and that is exactly what happens. And so now their transport is in the plane. But in all the solar cells that I've been describing, the vertical direction is the one in which we need to extract out the electrons. And so we need some kind of technique to allow these light-absorbing materials to stand up. And there is some beautiful work in which, rather than just making rods, researchers were able to make tetrapods. And so now one had little pointy-up rods with little legs that sat on the ground like little stools and that became oriented as a result of this geometry. So it combined the fact now that electrons were able to flow along these longitudinal directions through the rod sticking up and then through the legs of the stool. It combined that with this orientation such that now the direction in which the transport of electrons was the best was also the direction in which transport of electrons was most urgently needed. Another area in which quantum solids have seen great promise and great progress recently is in making solar devices and making materials for solar cells where we take these quantum particles, we take advantage of their quantum size effect tunability, and we pack them the way eggs are packed into a carton, into what we call a superlattice. We've seen some of these images actually before when we were speaking of nanomotifs. And they're beautiful, and they're also a fascinating exploration in engineering on multiple length scales, because the things that we're building these superlattices from are themselves crystals. We have ordered, oriented atoms on the scale of a ½ nanometer, repeating themselves, again like eggs in a carton, to make up a nanoparticle, say 3 nanometers in diameter. But here, in this transmission electron micrograph, we see many of these identical particles ordering, self-organizing into a perfect lattice themselves. So we have multiple length scales of order, and each of those length scales is important. The first one, the smaller length scale, the arraying of the atoms, ends up achieving the semiconductor properties and the transport properties that we desire. And then the second, the larger length scale of a few nanometers, well, that's the characteristic wavelength of electrons. That's the length scale over which we need electrons to propagate. And so, whereas in the initial work on colloidal quantum dot solar cells, the electron transport has been rather poor and has limited the performance of these solar cells, there's a great sense of optimism that transport associated with coupling these nanoparticles together and packing them into a superlattice can achieve the rest of the progress needed to make these colloidal quantum dot solar cells highly efficient, as well as very convenient to manufacture and correspondingly low in cost. Finally, I'd like to talk about a third class of so-called third-generation solar cells. These are called dye-sensitized solar cells. Dye-sensitized solar cells are really a fascinating convergence of some traditional fields of chemistry, like the electrochemistry that's the basis for batteries, with solar energy harvesting. And the way in which they work is they achieve light absorption using a dye, using a pigment, such as what you'd find in food coloring or to dye clothing with. And these, of course, are very good. These molecules are very good at the absorption of light. But on their own, they're not conductors. And so the insights from the field of dye-sensitized solar cells is these dyes have been put on essentially a sponge, in the inner surfaces of a sponge, of a semiconductor material that's very good at the transport of electrons. And in fact, the way in which these are built is that this sponge is infiltrated. So the huge surface area of this sponge, a transparent sponge, is used in order to make sure that every pigment, every dye, is directly coupled immediately in immediate proximity to an electron acceptor that can extract the electrons out. And so the concept actually has a relationship to the bulk heterojunction that we were talking about in the case of the organic solar cells, in which we had there this interpenetration of materials. But in both cases, what we're really taking advantage of is our capacity when engineering with nanomaterials to maximize surface areas for beneficial effects in this case. In this case, it's to achieve very strong absorption and yet to ensure that every one of our dyes, every one of our pigment molecules is coupled to an electron acceptor. In fact, there's another way in these devices to take advantage of the nano world, which is instead of making a sponge with kind of packing of spheres together and then tacking the dyes onto that, there's been recent work in which one makes a bunch of fingers, an array of fingers, a set of nanowires, and the dye is placed onto that, is coupled to that. And now, instead of going through a torturous path of transport through this set of spheres that are loosely coupled at their junctures, at their points of contact, one has a straight line, one has a direct avenue towards the extraction of photogenerated electrons that are produced inside the pigments, but then are transferred to these elevator shafts that directly transmit the electrons out of the device, the intent being to achieve a maximum of efficiency in the extraction of those electrons. Some of these exciting new technologies are being commercialized, and some of their commercial applications are taking advantage of the attractive properties of physically flexible materials. We can go beyond just thinking about installing these materials on rooftops or integrating them into building materials, though those concepts are exciting in themselves. But things like solar backpacks or mobile phones or tablet devices that are self-charging, or tents in which we're able to achieve energy harvesting. These are all on the near horizon for taking advantage of new breakthroughs in the conversion of energy from the sun into practical electricity.
Surgery is currently the most effective and widely used procedure in treating human cancers, and it's also essential in the treatment of other diseases like kidney failure and heart disease. A recent study indicated that for particular types of cancer, surgery can cure 45% of cancer patients when it's used for treatment, whereas radiation or drugs only provide a 5% cure rate. But to be curative, surgery has to be done incredibly precisely. Incomplete removal of a tumor can decrease survival rates significantly. In order to completely excise cancer, a surgeon needs to be able to identify tumor tissue and distinguish it from healthy tissue. Where these two different types of cells come together are called the margins of a tumor. And it's very important to take as little of the healthy tissue as possible, because there could be important nerves or blood vessels in the tissue. So getting the margins of a tumor defined precisely is very important, and it's also really hard. Surgeons need to get all of the tumor, yet nothing but the tumor. Now, surgeons use different types of guides, like radioactive tracers or visual or tactile inspection of tissue, to make a call on whether tissue is diseased. Studies have been done looking at how often surgeons are correct in thinking that they have removed all of the cancer cells in a patient, and almost 40% of the time, cancer cells are actually left behind. So it's obviously difficult to get this right with the tools that we have available. And the lymphatic system complicates things further. Lymph nodes are present throughout our bodies to trap foreign particles. Cancer cells spreading from a tumor site will often first travel to lymph nodes. And so surgeons usually take samples of the lymph nodes close to a tumor, and then the lymph node samples that are acquired can tell you whether the cancer has started to spread. But figuring out where these nodes are can be very tricky. When Richard Feynman first started talking about nanotechnology in 1959, one of the things that fascinated him was the possibility of producing nanoscale surgical tools. The material we'll talk about today shows that this is becoming a reality. In fact, there's a whole toolbox now of nanoscale surgical tools that will improve surgery in more ways than Feynman originally suggested. Not only can surgeons perform the operation using nanoscale tweezers and scalpels, they will eventually also be able to use nanomaterials for more accurate diagnosis and assessment. For example, by identifying tumor margins and lymph nodes with greater precision. And when the procedure is over, other nanomaterials can be used therapeutically to speed up the healing of a wound. So let's start by talking about how nanomaterials can make the assessment of tumor margins more precise and allow surgeons to see the boundaries of tumors more clearly. As I mentioned, there are nerves and blood vessels near tumors that have to be avoided at all costs, making surgeons very conservative when taking extra tissue. Typically, when an operation is complete, a surgeon will take a small sample of tissue that they consider to be outside the margins of the tumor, and this tissue is tested post-surgery. In breast cancer, as many as 50% of partial mastectomy cases require a second procedure owing to the fact that there's tumor found outside where surgeons thought the margins were. Surgeons are obviously very conservative when they remove breast tissue in order to lessen adverse impacts on a woman's health or self-image, and this is a tough thing to balance with making sure that all the tumor cells are gone. In early-stage lung cancer, residual tumor deposits after surgery are associated with up to a 35% reduction in survival. Here, it's critical to take as little lung tissue as possible because the tumors are typically located near airways. Likewise, with brain tumors, the stakes are extremely high as every extra cell that is taken can interfere with the survival of a patient. The limiting factor in detecting microscopic tumors or defining the borders of a tumor at the time of surgery is really the sensitivity of the human eye. The eye can only resolve objects that are about the size of a dust mite. So that's about 250 microns in size. So most microscopic tumors or cell clusters can't be spotted with a background of normal tissue around. Really only in special cases are tumor cells visually distinct from healthy cells. So this makes it even more challenging to selectively take them out. Now, if residual tumor cells could be detected in real time in the operating room, surgical resection of the tumor could be more accurate, and then survival rates would increase dramatically. The imaging of tumor cells during surgery using nanoparticles has already been shown to be a very powerful approach to improving surgical removal of brain tumors in lab animals. In 2002, a group of researchers in Boston at the Massachusetts General Hospital and Harvard Medical School showed that iron nanoparticles could be used very effectively for this application. They made a really cool type of iron oxide nanoparticle that would help with the visualization of a brain tumor before surgery using MRI, and that would also help light up the tumor with luminescence during surgery. Now, MRI is a very powerful tool for the visualization of tumors, but it's incredibly expensive to use. The instruments are really expensive, and so it can't be used in every operating room. On the other hand, luminescence is pretty easy to track and requires only a cheap excitation source. Sometimes just a handheld lamp will do. So the researchers that made these bifunctional nanoparticles managed to make something that was good at giving off both types of signals, so the MRI signal and the luminescence signal. The iron oxide core that they used had magnetic properties that were really great for getting a strong MRI signal. And then they joined this core with a chemical dye that would emit light when it was excited. They injected this compound material into mice that had brain tumors, and then they allowed the nanoparticles to circulate for 24 hours. They collected MRI images, and these images showed the researchers exactly where the tumors were. With these images in hand, knowing where the tumors were, they opened up the skulls of the animals and used the luminescence signal to make a second call on precisely where the tumor tissue was. The image that you're looking at shows the tumor lighting up because of the presence of the nanoparticles. Once the surgery was done, they looked at the entire brain of the animals with methods that can only be used post-mortem, and they were able to determine that all of the cancer cells were gone. Well, and how did they do this? How did they look at the brain once the animal had been taken apart? Well, basically, they sectioned the brain tissue, and then they incubated the tissue slices with stains that give a visual clue about whether a cell is diseased or healthy. This type of analysis works for postmortem analysis, but it's obviously not something we can do with a living subject who would need the tissue back. So clearly, giving the human eye some more help in the form of glowing nanoparticles is an extremely powerful approach to improving the surgical removal of brain tumors. This was a really amazing study that back in 2003 was one of the first to prove the utility of nanomaterials for surgery. And the fact that this test case involved brain tumors makes it that much more incredible. This may not have occurred to you yet, but in order for these nanoparticles to do what they did, they had to cross something called the blood-brain barrier. As the name implies, this barrier is a shield around the brain that is very difficult to get through. There's a network of capillaries that surround the brain. If you placed all these capillaries end to end, they would span about 400 miles. And on top of that, the capillaries are very densely packed and they have lots and lots of cells in them to ensure that only certain things make it to the brain. Small molecules that are about a nanometer, things like sugar, alcohol, nicotine, also certain antidepressant drugs, are good at getting through this barrier. But typically, large molecules can't get through. The fact that iron nanoparticles that were 50 nanometers were actually able to make it across is really surprising and obviously very fortuitous. Exactly how this works, though, we really don't know yet. Many people around the world are trying to understand which combinations of properties allow these particles to trick the capillaries into letting them through. But it looks like we're going to have to wait a little while in order to have that answer. Now, another type of surgical precision that can be enhanced by nanomaterials is the visualization of sentinel lymph nodes. As you may be aware, the lymphatic system is a network of vessels that instead of carrying blood, carries lymph. Lymph is a fluid that contains much of the waste generated by cells, and it's also used to transport foreign cells to the lymph nodes where they can be destroyed. So the lymphatic system provides another route for cancer cells to move around the body. And some cancers spread in a predictable fashion from where the cancer started. And their first stop is a lymph node or a gland close to the tumor, and it goes there before the cancer spreads to other parts of the body. The lymph node closest to the tumor is referred to as the sentinel lymph node, or SLN. So the idea behind surgery on SLNs is to see if the cancer has spread. If the sentinel lymph node does not contain cancer, then there's a high likelihood that the cancer has not spread to any other part of the body. The way that SLNs are typically imaged involves the injection of a radioactive tracer near the tumor. A Geiger counter can then be used by the surgeon to track the tracer as it moves to the SLN. Now, using radioactivity for this is not ideal. Lots of radioactive substances are somewhat harmful. And this is where nanomaterials may be able to provide an alternative solution. In 2006, researchers working with semiconductor quantum dots noticed that when infrared-emitting semiconductor quantum dots were injected into a tumor, they localized right to the sentinel lymph nodes. The quantum dots clearly found the same path that metastatic cancer cells take through the lymphatic system to reach the SLN. It took only 15 seconds for the lymph nodes to light up, and so this would allow a surgeon to visualize the right lymph node and take samples for biopsy in real time. The pig model system that they use for these trials is what's called the Sinclair mini swine. This is a type of pig that has been engineered to spontaneously develop melanoma. And melanoma is a very relevant type of cancer for sentinel lymph node mapping, because about 70% of melanomas in humans metastasize by passing through the lymph nodes. The pig form of melanoma is quite similar to the human form, so this is a really relevant system for the testing of the quantum dot imaging approach. Another feature of these pigs that is indirectly useful is that they have highly pigmented skin and dark hair, which is a little bit unusual for a pig, but that's what these guys have. And this makes it more of a challenge to detect the light being given off by the quantum dots in the lymph nodes. And so getting proof of principle, even in this system, makes it that much more likely that it would work in humans. The use of nanomaterials to find lymph nodes is likely several years away from being used in humans, but the potential for impact on surgical outcomes is significant. Lymph node resection is one of the most difficult things for surgeons to learn when they are using existing techniques for visualization. So it can take new surgeons over 60 surgeries to achieve technical proficiency, leaving all of the patients with incomplete resections unless somebody more experienced is looking over the shoulder of the inexperienced surgeon. So being able to use nanoparticles to illuminate lymph nodes should make the learning curve much less steep. Now, what if someday we were able to teach robots to perform surgery rather than relying on people? This may seem kind of far out, but it turns out that robotic surgery is something that's already being used today. The most common types of robotic surgeries actually have a human being controlling the robotics, but using the robot as an interface to the patient helps eliminate tremors, and it allows finer manipulations to be made. And it also allows surgery to be done remotely, as already happened in 2001 when a surgeon in New York removed a gallbladder in a patient in France. But one thing that robots really lack is a sense of touch. And for most types of surgery, it turns out that this is quite important. A fine sense of touch allows a surgeon to know how much force to use, and it may also give them information about the health of a tissue. A really neat nano device may provide a solution here and give robots a sense of touch. This device is basically a nanoparticle sandwich. There are 2 layers of gold nanoparticles on the outside of the sandwich and a layer of cadmium sulfide nanoparticles on the inside of the sandwich. The 2 kinds of particles are separated by a layer of squishy plastic. And when stress is placed on the gold nanoparticles on the outside, this causes them to get closer to the cadmium sulfide, and then the coupling between the 2 types of nanoparticles causes light to be emitted. Now, by coupling, I mean electronic coupling, or the extent to which the particles can feel the presence of the others. So now that we've seen how nanotechnology can be used to visualize or feel tumors and also to visualize the spread of cancer cells, let's talk about some other promising approaches to the development of nanoscale surgical tools. The better we get at seeing cancer cells, the better able we'll be to take only the diseased cells during surgery and leave the healthy cells behind. But in order to be able to cut out a single cell, a very small scalpel would obviously be required. Throughout this course, we've looked at nanomaterials that certainly should be able to achieve this kind of resolution, but only if they could be manipulated at the macroscale. But this is the tricky part. We can't hold a single nanotube in our hand, so how could this type of material be used? Well, a study reported in the journal Science in 1999 described a really clever approach that gives us some leads on this. So what was done here is that a 1,000 nanometer glass rod was attached to 2 carbon nanotubes, and the attachment sites were made of metal so that they could serve as electrodes. When there was no potential applied to the electrodes, the carbon nanotubes remained apart. But when 8 volts were applied, the tips of the 2 carbon nanotubes were drawn together. This amazing set of images shows exactly what happens. You can see that as the applied voltage increases, the carbon nanotube tips get closer and closer until they're touching. So this device acts just like a pair of tweezers and could be able to pick up a single cell. This hasn't actually been tested yet, but the researchers working with the nanotube nanotweezers did show that they could pick up a single plastic particle with a diameter of 500 nanometers. You're looking at an image that shows the tweezers grabbing the particle and keeping a firm grip on it. Another way that increased precision could be achieved during surgery is through the use of nanolasers. Very fast and focused laser pulses are able to target single cells or even substructures within cells. This type of approach has been used to cut single nerves in tiny worms. These worms are just 1 millimeter in length. Now, why is it useful to practice surgery on worms? That may not seem obvious. Well, this is a good model system where the amount of precision needed to cut a single nerve measuring just a few microns could be validated. And it also provides the opportunity to be able to watch the regrowth of the nerve in real time. So this will help us understand how nerves can regenerate themselves. What we've looked at so far are different tools that can assist the precision of surgery. Now let's look at an interesting material that can help in a different way. One of the most difficult things to deal with during surgery is excessive bleeding. During the surgery, a cut is made and perhaps it nicks a blood vessel, and this can produce a lot of blood. And I'm sure you've seen medical dramas where a surgeon is yelling clamp and a nurse whips out a pair of arterial forceps, also known as a hemostat. And these things, you probably have seen them. They look almost like a pair of scissors, but they're really clamping a blood vessel shut. In addition, there are chemicals that can be used to stop bleeding, but they're not very fast acting. But now, brain researchers have discovered a new nanomaterial that could be very effective at stopping bleeding during neurosurgical procedures and other types of surgery. They were working with a peptide that self-assembles into a nanofiber. And these researchers were initially studying whether it could be used as a drug to repair brain damage. But what they discovered instead was that the peptide was really good at stopping bleeding really fast. In addition to being a very useful material to have on hand during surgery, this could also be an important tool for treating acute trauma where there's lots and lots of bleeding. And maybe someday a peptide that self-assembles into a nanofiber, it could even replace the Band-Aid. In my house, we have 2 little boys running around, and Band-Aids are always being used to deal with scratches and scrapes. Both kids usually have a few somewhere on their body at any given time. But as you know, especially for little boys who love dirt, Band-Aids get dirty, and they're not great when it comes to keeping a cut clean. So maybe someday we'll have in our kitchens a little tube of this material that could be used as artificial skin while a cut heals. Nanomaterials can also be used to speed wound healing and limit infection. Silver nanoparticles are particularly promising for this application. It's been known for some time that silver nanoparticles can kill bacteria, and so they're a good way to keep bacteria from infecting a wound. But studies investigating this in rats showed something remarkable. The particles also made the wounds heal faster. This was a study where they were comparing silver nanoparticles with antibiotics, and it was discovered that burn wounds were completely healed 4 days earlier when silver nanoparticles were used. And in addition, the amount of scarring was reduced. So if you look at these images, you're looking at rats that have burn wounds on their backs. If the wounds are treated with silver nanoparticles, the rats have totally healed and regrown their fur in 25 days. Without the silver nanoparticles, you can see that the rats are still in pretty tough shape. But it's not just the presence of silver. Studies were also done with non-nanostructured silver, and it really didn't have any effect. Silver sulfadiazine is actually used clinically for burn treatment, but its effectiveness is pretty limited. Here, having silver present as a nanoparticle really seems to pump up the effect of the metal. We think that the nanoparticles fool the immune system into not overdoing the immune response, which then cuts down on inflammation. And since the nanoparticles kill any bacteria that might find their way into a wound, this is good. Now, in addition to promoting healing, nanoparticles can also be used to solder a cut shut. We've all had the unpleasant experience of getting stitches and then getting them removed, and using a nanoparticle glue may present a more pleasant alternative. A study that was recently done at Rice University in 2005 showed that this is indeed possible. Using rats as model patients, they applied gold nanoparticles to cuts and then hit the nanoparticles with 800 nanometer near-infrared light and heat soldered the wound shut. They also generated a control group that had conventional stitches. In these images, you're looking at a comparison of two cuts. The top one had stitches, and the bottom one had the nanoparticle solder. You can see that the stitch wound actually heals faster, but both eventually heal. And the discomfort to a patient would really be minimized for the nanoparticle approach, so this really seems worth pursuing. The researchers also looked at the skin cells after the wound was healed, and they made sure that the cells were normal, and they really looked fine. So this seems like a promising way to repair cuts, and it's also been shown to work with muscle. There may also be a potential to use a similar approach to repair nerves or blood vessels, so we'll have to stay tuned to see where this goes. I think it's really clear from the material that we've covered that there is huge potential for nanotechnology to improve what happens before, during, and after surgery. There are many types of tools becoming available that make it easier for surgeons to be more precise, and that will also allow robots to acquire and enhance the capabilities that humans have. There is also the potential to make recovery from surgery faster, using better agents for wound healing and treatment. And while we focused in this lecture on cancers, similar kinds of techniques have also begun to make progress for cardiovascular diseases as well, such as arteriosclerosis, thrombosis, and myocardial infarction. Now, in discussing how nanotechnology can be used in surgery, we've thought lots about how to repair damage or take diseased cells away. What we haven't considered yet is how to bring healthy cells back. So in the case of spinal cord damage or brain damage, the damage is almost always irreversible. And this is because we don't know how to coerce new cells to grow, and our bodies aren't very good at getting this done either. In the next lecture, we'll look at the role that nanomaterials are playing in a really interesting area, regenerative medicine. In this field, scientists are figuring out how to use nanomaterials to get new cells to grow where there's been damage, and replacing not just cells, but entire tissues. And progress is even being made on generating artificial organs outside of the body to help us with organ transplants. And even though cells aren't truly nanoscale, we are learning how to get them to form tissues using nanomaterials by providing the same cues as cells get in natural tissues. This is a very interesting and fast-moving field, and I think you'll find learning about it to be fascinating. See you next time.